Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here, and another installment of Pure Gnosis. What I'm going to cover today is the interesting person of Angela Thompson Smith, a remote viewer and researcher, and her interesting book, SEER, S-E-E-R-S, 30 Years of Remote Viewing and Counting. Well, this is a very interesting book that what's nice about it is that it goes over a long period of time and kind of sums up what happened and what didn't. One of the problems is that almost all the talk by the remote viewers, since they are almost all of them that are public writing books and making a fortune off of it, are government whores. They talk only about things that happened 40 years ago and nothing of recent. So you hear the same old stories repeated over and over again by McGonagall, Targ, and everybody else because they can't say anything. What's the point of doing research then, other than filling your pockets? I've pretty much had it with these whole group of losers that have done very little. Russell Targ just hired some goofball little $2 producer to make some sort of Third Eye Spy documentary. That's all he could get. That's all he knows, really. So the whole idea is that this is the kind of nonsense that they continue to perpetrate. And apparently SRI that Targ ran was quite a luxurious, wonderful place. After all, they had millions of dollars poured into them over the years and built quite a facility. So the whole idea is that when you bring in this whole area of remote viewing, it's gotten a lot of publicity. There are hundreds of books written on it by all of these government people, particularly military people, who've written about this for empowerment to make lots of money. They start organizations, they write books, they teach people, and they've filled their pockets to the guy. And that's all part of the reason what the government wanted them to do, which is why it allowed them to do it. It was all a big scheme to get people involved in this so they wouldn't have to train anybody and get involved with it, because support of these kind of things tend to be minor because of a very ignorant public. So it's very interesting to see her history. I mean, this is a person that kind of wormed her way into different organizations by donating her time and because she had some natural abilities. She's a Brit who earned a degree in nursing and then took this skill to America and was able to immigrate here easily, probably because she had a nursing degree, then started to get higher education through American institutions, which she got loans for and everything else, something I couldn't get when I went to college. Well, whatever. So, but reading her book further, and at the end of her book, it states how she was very involved all of her life in shamanic type practices and was always interested in all those areas and was tutored by some person in herbs and tinctures and flowers in her native area, and she was very earth-based. You could say very pagan-based, because that's what paganism, generally earth-based religions, etc., and was very involved in that as well as all the other astrological things. Not astrological, all the other metaphysical things in that area. So she had this great interest, so it wasn't like she just popped up somewhere. So she knew she had these psychic abilities, and then went to these places, and she knew that she could worm her way into these institutes, donating her time, because you don't get paid in any of this stuff. But, one way of getting in an organization and getting around things is by donating your time. It's an old trick, and it does work. So you donate your time, you get involved in projects, and hang around for months or even years. Finally, something will come up that you can benefit from personally. And pretty much this is what she did. This is way past the military time, even though she, of course, runs into all those military people from the past, because that's who's in remote viewing. But she did get involved with the lab at that time that was going on there at Princeton. Princeton had a lab run by a top engineer who had some connections, and they were investigating all these things, which was the way things were done. In the early 80s, late 70s, there was still interest in this, and people could get funding. And apparently he had funding from even one of the Rockefellers that was new there. And of course, Princeton is one of those top schools. You don't hear too much about it, but it's one of those Ivy League schools. So she got involved with that, and she talked about the lab and how she worked there and everything else. And and so forth. And how they used in particular, they were using this institute and others as we train people. They were using all kinds of different interesting games. Well, how interesting is that? Well, as usual, people, what I tell you is always correct. So they were using all types of little games that they invented or ones that were just off the market to actually help people develop their abilities and to test how often they could get these, quote, games right. Meaning whether it was guessing a card or other things, what could they figure out? So it's very, very interesting. But, going through this particular book, and I do want to spend some time in different areas because it is very interesting and highlighted, is looking at it from a success or manifesting science viewpoint in terms of, what I'm interested in is cold, hard results, plain and simple. I don't care about how warm and fuzzy it is. What are the results? How can you use this to manifest in life? Because manifesting it's all about, and you don't have money, nothing happens. And this book is a shining example of how underfunded this field is and how someone like her did nothing but struggle her entire life up to this day, apparently, because she never could make enough money. And of course, there's some holes there as well, but the plain and simple fact is it's very difficult to make money in these areas. And that's another thing, because I run the only success science, cult science business school. Well, how do you make money in this area? If we're going to bring people into this field of quality and keep people working, well, you have to make money at it. If you do it as a hobby, there's a serious problem. You never get good people. Nobody can put the time into it, and you end up falling away from it other than a collector's hobby. So this gives you an excellent overview of what's happening in the last, the book is relatively recent. It was published in 2016, and as of the recording of this tape in approximately 2020. So we're only about 4 years that we don't know about of what she's been interested in. So that's pretty new for these kind of books, because you read all these remote viewing books, and as I said, they're all going back 20, 30, 40 years, because that's what they've been okayed to talk about by their military owners, their handlers. So you don't really get any good information. It's the same old stories over and over again about we found a Russian submarine. We drew a picture. Okay, mechanic. Oh, yeah. We know. Okay, so the whole idea is that these kind of boring things you hear over and over again, which don't relate to modern life at all, just get stooges involved in these practices that think that's kind of impressive because that's what they want to tell everybody, because it's so unclassified, it is, and nobody even cares about it. It's so low there. They write about these things in comic books and in gumball wrappers. It's so common. So the whole idea is that you hear this over and over again. So we do have modern stuff from her and as she went through, and there's a lot of different missing data, interesting stuff here about her personal life, which I guess really doesn't matter, but it does pertain to the fact of that her struggle consistently in trying to make a living. Even though were many different groups started, and these groups had a certain amount of clients, but apparently they never could make enough money. And I don't know, the one, unfortunately, and large gap in her particular book is the fact of what she was paid. She talks about taking on clients and other things, and while she didn't name the clients, she should have named how much money she made from them so people would have an understanding of, what do you charge for this in general? What were they getting paid? There's also massive gaps between a lot of the cases, and apparently she would supply free information or extremely low cost, and nobody would give her feedback. Now, this can be interpreted in two ways. They were successful and they didn't bother. That sounds to me that wouldn't be the case. Or nobody really cared because it wasn't right and they just wrote it off. Why call somebody and say, oh, you're an idiot? Generally, people call you and say how wonderful things are. So when you do get contact from people, when it's something dramatic, and a lot of these things are very dramatic, so it's not like the average success someone has. But there's huge gaps there, and there's huge gaps in many areas. And for a person who was educated and so forth, well, she had to get many regular jobs working as because she was in the healthcare industry, working as managers for retirement homes and other places to make her money. And apparently, right up to modern times, was really not doing well and just barely scrapes by. Living in Boulder, Colorado, a suburb of sorts of Las Vegas, where housing is relatively inexpensive. So, what does all that mean? She also worked for one of the major foundations, the Robert Bigelow Foundation, whatever its name is, who sponsored many people, including the person who started Art Bell, which is another topic I will talk about in another video. So the whole idea is that, which apparently didn't pay her very much, and of course put her to work as a clerk, apparently, which obviously someone of her skill didn't appreciate, and finally gave up on it after a couple of years and moved on. And apparently even working that job barely paid the bills, apparently. So it was typical, even a person like him who's heavily connected to the government and everything else, supposedly a large apartment builder, real estate guy, who's now trying to build in space and put hotels up there, and who's heavily connected in that particular area, funded certain things. But it doesn't seem like they're funding much. I mean, for a guy who has a lot of money, they're not putting that into people, and they're not putting it, because why pay anybody? They're suckers anyway, aren't they? All these empowered people that want to make money for other people, but live in their car while they're telling people to where to invest and make millions. And I've seen this in a lot of places where people are living in trailers who are doing divinations and trying to empower other people when they have no success in their own life. So these are just quite amusing, but apparently there isn't much success there. And I'm not sure, which would be an interesting topic in general. Well, how do all these parapsychologists make their money? We do know that they work for and do regular jobs for colleges and universities, which pay extremely well. College professors make a lot of money. Lots and lots of money. And they're involved in other projects where they make more money on top of their salary. But how is their money basically made? They don't seem to be trying to make much money. They're always struggling to get funding, but what do they care? Because they're still teaching English at that college, and what they're studying in parapsychology is a secondary. Or however that system works. It would be nice to hear how that system particularly works, but certainly they're not leaving much, and they're certainly not putting out a mass amount of books or other information to either educate people or even to make money from. Most have all written some books, but the amount of books they read, the number of books, is quite low. If you're going to make money in book sales, it means you have to write books consistently, and you think there'd be enough of their research that they could do that with. Not, at least they're not coming out with it. So this is a fascinating story of kind of an average empowered person who considers herself really a shaman, and in her later life years kind of dedicated herself to the shamanistic path, which is the use of magic. Basically, this is just the magical path, and she's tuned into all these things. But how does this actually unfold, and what are the step-by-step process that she found out in life in terms of things that happen, the projects she worked on? Now, she's went into all these and talked about the many different projects she worked on. And initially, I was kind of excited, and it was interesting, particularly the tests that were taken by herself personally, proving that she was a very psychic person. She scored very high and was able to master many of these, quote, games to show that she had great abilities in most of these kind of testing areas. And this was very exciting because these are the kind of things that I teach other people and tell them to do as well. So it was interesting to see all that noted and so forth. Well, we start getting into this whole remote viewing, this consciousness projection, this astral projection area. Things go from bright and sunny to pretty dark. And I'm not talking about the projects they took on. I'm talking about the light of success. Success is very bright. It's a 200-watt bulb. Don't look at it. It's bright. It's success. That's why. You can't look at success. It's too bright. Failure, on the other hand, is as dim as they get. Almost total darkness. And her entire career is pretty dim. And she was working with most of the top professionals in the field. And she was sought out by all these top professionals. And it's interesting that all these companies started by these boobalicious, goofball military guys, all those companies are dead now. Sci-Tech, the big thing started, gone. They're all gone. And why is that? Because they were so successful? Something tells me that ain't the case at all. These things didn't work out because they were not successful. And of course, they won't share, We can't tell, it's all private information, yeah. Well, why would that possibly be? If you were successful, why wouldn't you continue to do this? And why wouldn't you be doing other? They do like everybody. Those that can't do, teach. And all of them teach, as Angela fell back on teaching, because that's where the money is. But applying it to the real world doesn't seem to work very well for these holla-trained government hillbillies. Yeah, we know where the riskies are. We seen a boat somewhere. I see a boat. It's in the water. It's near a beach. I'm a genius remote viewer. Tune in. So the whole idea is that this kind of horrible type of remote viewing is permeating through this. And I'm going to give you all sorts of examples here because this is a fascinating book and I've got an awful lot in there that I want to talk about because it pertains to many elements that success tech is all about. And that includes the fact of, how do you take the skills that you learn or have and that we've honed for you and make money with it so you can do something in life of value. And so there's a lot to be talked about here of what it is and what people pay, etc., from what we can tell from just this kind of written record, which is one of the newer things. Of course, it goes back to the early 90s, or, 30 years ago back. So the whole idea is that, which is good basic information. And of course, it names all of the criminals, remote viewer government people that started all this stuff and that were involved in all these organizations that were started later. It's amazing how it's the same 10 culprits. And, of course, old General Alexander pops up, retired. I was in Vietnam fighting on the ground. I lost every battle. Now we know what's going on. I'm a great researcher. So, this guy who's wormed his way into all these different organizations so he can report back to his cronies, his CIA buddies, who was given a cushy, very profitable and wealthy paying, super high salary that he got as a government advisor for Los Alamos weapons division. So, these people are paid a fortune. This is the kind of things you get as a military officer, ex-military officer when you retire. They hire these guys for huge salaries because they go in and with their buddies and they get contracts for you. It's all, under the table. Yeah. So he all knows everybody and get through the old gates there, flashing his old badge of murderability, and is able to do all this. Of course, he can't say anything, he can't do anything. You'll never hear anything out of him. He talks all the time about a bunch of non-essential, worthless things, but he'll never talk about anything that really works. All he's doing is sucking information so he can then pass this back to his military buddies, where he makes more and more money from all the payouts he gets and all the things that happen. This is how the system works. Of course, that is allegedly how everything works. So this is the way of the program. He's the guy that wrote that there is no military contact with extraterrestrials, except in all the Freedom of Information Act reports that people have gotten from everybody. There's stacks of them. There's books written entirely on this, like Full Disclosure and other books that were published in the 80s, for Christ's sake. And he came out with his buddy, Mr. Francois, who said, there is no extraterrestrial. I'll tell you right now, I looked into it, and I would know. Everybody loves me. I know everything. So the point is that He gave the company line again, like all the other things that happened, and like it was weather balloons at Roswell, which the military came up and said again is their final report. It's such a joke, it isn't even funny. But they weren't just weather balloons. They had little dummies attached on them. So, these little dummies attached on them were the bodies that people thought were there. I mean, it goes on and on with this nonsense. Well, in my other parts of this will be a multi-part video, go into all these different areas, which are very fascinating and very important, as I said, to Success Tech and to all of our business school and otherwise students that are training in these areas, because we do expect to have our own course on remote viewing, astral projection ourselves. So people understand what's going on in these entire areas and really get the good stuff. You know, the compiling of all these different books and their data of what the different systems are, what works, and, you know, talking about things like this book and what has been achieved from it past the gossip. So, and this goes for everybody on both sides of this. You know, Russell Targ's not going to come out and say that his information is mediocre because he's not going to get any more grants. He makes his living here. So he certainly isn't doing anything practically, at least not that any of these people talk about. And that's another big issue that we'll have to get into, which is a whole section of this particular talk on this book in general. And what about all that stuff? And there's a lot of information on this in this book of using these things for more direct empowerment or profit that everyone should know about. Very, very fascinating information. We're going to get into all this, and this is very important to the serious Success Tech student, the IJOS student that wants to know, you know, really what's going on. And the only person who can judge stuff like this is myself, who can look at it from a neutral position and interpret the writings in this book at the proper level. I mean, you need to know a whole bunch to read a book and get out of it what is written, what is non-written, what's between the lines, what was meant, what is hidden. I mean, it takes a very educated, highly advanced person to figure that out. And quite frankly, who else is there out there? Well, there may be a few educated people, but no one has reached my level or spent 45, almost 50 years now researching all these areas from a high level of understanding or the state of gnosis. You cannot underestimate the power of that. Because if you get a remote viewer or some parapsychologist to review a book and try and pick out salient or interesting information in the bigger picture, what do they care? They're not business people. They're not surviving from that. They got big-time degrees living off of the fat pig of academia who pays them a lot of money, and then they can play and write books on the side. They don't care about any of that stuff, and they're not geared into survival. They're not doing things that really matter. And there seems to be little or no work coming from any of these people. All of the classic parapsychologists from Tart to Mishlove haven't written books in 20 years. So all of this information is very important to be interpreted properly, and you're lucky because you got me. Until next time.